Hello everybody, I'm Nora and welcome back to this video series. This is a three-part video series on making and hanging a quilt for outside. So if you haven't seen episode 1, go check out episode 1. That's where we make the quilt blocks for the top of the quilt. We have 25 quilt blocks. Each quilt block is 10 by 10 inches. But if you haven't seen that first video, check that out where we make the quilt blocks. In this video, we are going to do a quilt as you go method to attach all of our existing quilt blocks. And then in video 3, we will take our quilt outside, we'll hang a clothesline, and then hang the quilt on the clothesline, just like Mary Fons. Mary Fons, famous quilter, she inspired me. I'm giving you the brief version here. If you want the full version about Mary Fons, check out the first video. But Mary Fons, famous quilter, she was saying that during COVID, she would hang a quilt on her fire escape. She lives in Chicago in an apartment building, and that she felt like it brought her some joy to think that some of her neighbors in other buildings were stuck inside and they'd look out their window and see these beautiful quilts, and she would kind of change out the quilts every so often and that kind of thing. So I wanted to do something similar, but I don't have a fire escape. So I'm making this quilt to hang in my yard. I'm making the quilt because I anticipate this quilt getting very dirty with things like bird poop and dirt and drizzling rain and things. So I wanted to make a quilt with my scraps, my bright colored scraps, specifically for the yard. So that's the brief version of episode 1, in case you don't want to go back and watch that whole thing again. Now, one of the great things about the quilt as you go is that you never have to put the full bulk of your quilt underneath your sewing machine. And you can roll it up, and I do that. I'll roll it up and kind of scrunch it over under the machine, but it's not easy. So the quilt as you go, you're kind of always working on the outside, and so you never have to put a huge chunk under the arm of your machine, which is fantastic. Now, I have never made the quilt as you go method. I've never used this method before. So we'll see how it goes. I'm interested to see if I like this process or not. I also wanted to mention that I cut 25 batting squares. You want to cut your batting squares to be the same size as the top of your quilt, your top squares. So mine will be 10 inches in diameter. The way that I'm going to connect these together is you want to sew them right sides together with a 1-inch seam. So I'm going to put these right sides together. This is the right side of your fabric, and the back is the wrong side of the fabric. And then I'm going to sew a 1-inch seam. Now I'm going to chain piece these together. So instead of sewing this seam and opening it up and then sewing these two together to make my next seam, instead of doing that, I'm going to sew these two together, and then I'll sew these two together, and then I'll have a single one over there. That's 5th, so I'll let that be. Then these two together and these two together, and you get the idea, so on and so forth. Then I'll have a bunch, when I open these up, I'll have a bunch of 2 pieces sewn together, and then I'll connect the next ones. But as you can imagine, this could end up getting a little bit complicated in terms of keeping my pieces in the order that I want them. I am going to take a picture of the order of these fabrics, and that way if I really start to mess things up, I can always go back to my picture to see where things are supposed to be. But in addition to taking a picture, I'm going to take these clips and I'm going to clip the pieces of fabric that I want to sew together. As you can see, I have clipped the pieces that I am going to sew together. Now, remember 2 things. First of all, these are the back sides of your quilt that we're sewing right now. We aren't touching the fronts yet. The other thing is you want to sew the rows together. This is the step of sewing rows together, but do not connect your rows. So if this is my bottom row, do not connect your bottom row to the row above it yet. We will eventually, but not yet. I'm going to put my first set underneath the sewing machine and sew all the way down. Take my clip off. That's not what I wanted to do. I already made a mistake. I'm so used to sewing a 1/4 inch that I started sewing 1/4 inch down, but that's not what you want to do. I'm going to seam rip this out. Remember, you want an inch, a full inch, and I put this blue tape here so that I know I put my fabric right up against that blue line, and that will be 1 inch seam allowance. But let me seam rip this and then we'll start again. Let's try that again. 1 inch seam allowance. And when you get to the end, you're not gonna take your fabric off of the machine. You're gonna leave it there, and you're gonna take your next squares, and this is called chain piecing. This is how everything ends up being quick. Take your next squares and sew those. And again, when you get to the end, take your next set. Make sure that everything is lined up. It's really important. And you keep going. Once you've finished sewing all of your pairs, cut it off the sewing machine, and then cut apart all of the squares that you've sewn together. So now I've laid these back out. You can see that they've been sewn together here with the 1 inch seam. So now you'll just clip your next sets together, right? And once you sew those together, you'll add on your ends, and then we'll do the next step. Now remember, I have a whole nother 2 rows here that just don't fit on my dining room table, but I'll do those at the same time, but you'll just kind of see these 3 rows coming together. As you can see, I have the blocks for each row sewn together, but I have not sewn the rows to each other. So what the next step is I'm going to flip this over. I'm going to iron each one of these seams in half, just like this. Now, I'm going to take a sample quilt block here. Now, this one doesn't actually match with this specific piece of backing, but you'll get the idea of what's supposed to be happening here. So if you can see, if I get you close enough, maybe you can see that the edge of the quilt block lines right up to my stitching line. So there's my stitching line, and the quilt block goes right up on both sides to the edge. So this will be ironed over. And then when you tuck it down, we're gonna sew the seam, and that will enclose the block into the seam. So next step, we're still leaving our quilt top blocks aside. Next step is we are going to iron each seam right down in half. And then we'll be able to easily flip that over. I have ironed all of these pieces down. You see that used to be up, and then I ironed it down. So I did that for all the seams. And I put a piece of batting underneath each one of these square top blocks. So these blocks are the actual blocks that will be paired with these fabrics. This is where they'll go. So you have your backing all sewn together in a row with a piece of batting, and then your quilt top block. Then, if I were you, I'm not a big fan of pinning, as you all know. However, in this case, I think this is a good place to put a pin or two, because you want to make sure that you have a good inch on the top and on the bottom. And then you will sew right down each side. The other reason why this quilt as you go is so great is not only because you can fit it under the arm of your machine so easily, but also because you are putting together all the pieces of your quilt at once. So with a typical quilt, you would have to quilt together all of your blocks, right? Which is time consuming. You have to make the blocks, and then you have to sew the blocks together to make your quilt top. And then you have to make your quilt backing, and sometimes that's just cutting out a large piece of fabric, but sometimes you're sewing pieces together to make your backing. And then you have to quilt together your front and your batting and the back, and then you have to bind the whole thing. But with the quilt as you go, because you're attaching the pieces little by little, you're completing your quilt. So right now I'm securing each one of my quilt blocks and batting onto the row. And then for the next step, I will connect those rows, and then that's it. The quilt's done. There's no binding, there's no, securing batting. It's all done. So I'm excited about the potential, and then we'll touch base at the end of this video and let you know how I think it came out. I'm gonna take my first pin out and sew right along pretty much the middle, I think. Take my bottom pin out. see how that looks. So there's the first seam. Here's a better view. I think I would like to sew closer to the edge here. So in the future, I might even take this stitch out. I think I'm gonna seam rip that and sew as close as I can to the edge. I think that will just have it be a cleaner, finished look. So I'm gonna do that same thing with all of these. Here I've sewn a little bit closer to the edge than I did the first time, so instead of sewing down the middle, I sewed right as close as I could, and I think that looks much nicer. I'm very happy with that. So before you sew all of your seams down, if you want to do any quilting, so if you wanted to do like an X or do any stitch in the ditch or anything, this is the time that you would do that. But I'm not going to do any stitch in the ditch or any quilting, so I'm just going to go ahead and sew all my seams down. The blocks were a little bit finicky. This was a little more challenging to get these to lay flat than I had anticipated. So basically I would sew one side underneath the seam, which would be okay, and then when I got to the other side of the seam, it would kind of be not tucked in there nicely. It would be kind of bunchy, and I didn't like that so much. So I did end up doing some stitch in the ditch. Before I would secure it underneath both of the seams, I would do the stitch in the ditch, which I know I said I was not going to do any quilting on this, but it did help in kind of laying everything flat so that I could do a seam, and then this was already secured down at the stitch in the ditch, and then I could just fold this seam over, and it was all nice and crisp. So that worked well. For the next part, I'm gonna take my handy dandy pins here, and before I was just using these pins so that I could keep track of which pieces went together, but now I'm going to really use these to line everything up instead of using pins. Now, if you don't have these clips, pins work completely fine. I don't like pins for this kind of part as much because I'll show you why. When you take a pin, you put these, this is how we're gonna do it. We're gonna put the backings together, just like this. And when you pin, it kind of warps the fabric a little bit. Can you see how there's a bump there? It doesn't lay completely flat. And if you use a pin, it's completely flat. So that's why I like to use these for this type of project. But if you only have pins, that works too, but you are going to need to secure this in some way. So as you can see, what I did there is I'm gonna secure this row to this row, and you wanna make sure that you don't turn anything upside down or whatever. So I'm just going to pick these up by this intersection, just like this, and secure it along the top here. Once it's secured, you're going to sew 1 inch seam, just like you did to connect the pieces of your rows together. Now to connect the rows, you're also gonna sew the 1 inch seam. I have clipped these together, so everything is nice and lined up, everything is secure. I do a pin on each seam here, and you wanna make sure that the seam for one row lines up perfectly with the seam on the back of that row. All the way across, I do a pin in the middle of the block and on each seam. So now let's go ahead and sew this 1 inch seam allowance. My seam is sewn. I've removed my clips, and now I will spread this out. As you can see, my 1 inch seam goes straight up in the air. And what I'm gonna do next is fold one side in half and then fold it over and sew along this seam the whole way. I have sewn 2 rows together here, and let me tell you, this is more challenging than I hoped it would be. The sewing machine has a really hard time getting over a lot of this bulk. Here, let's debrief for a minute. So the sewing machine has a really difficult time getting over a lot of this bulk, especially where the 4 corners come together. That's especially challenging. And the fabric seems to be getting pulled a lot. I started out with my regular foot on my sewing machine, and that was just a hot mess. This is still a hot mess, but it's better once I put the walking foot on. But even with the walking foot, it was challenging. So I actually don't use my walking foot in quilting very frequently. I find that most projects just don't need it as much as people seem to think that they do. So I kind of let it collect dust in my drawer. However, for this project, you absolutely, in my opinion, need a walking foot. If you don't have one, you can probably push your way through it, but you're gonna have a lot of problems. I am not loving this quilting method as much as I thought that it would. I think that the time that you're potentially saving on this, doing it this way, is not worth the struggle and headache and manpower it goes into making all of these seams crisp and aligned. I don't think any of these are gonna be really as nicely done as if I were to quilt it in a regular way, to make a quilt in the way that I typically would with making the quilt front, attaching it to the batting, attaching it to the back, and then adding a border, a binding, is gonna be crisper and cleaner and look so much better. This is just not. I mean, I think even with practice, but take a look at some of these seams. Like, these are not attractive. And it's really, the sewing machine is having a hard time. I mean, these are not lovely looking seams. But that's okay. This is not an heirloom quilt. This is a quilt that's going in the yard, and I'm glad that I'm trying this out. So let's keep going. Let's take a look at the next step. So the next step is really the last step. You're gonna keep doing what you did for this row here. You're gonna attach this row to the next row, and then to attach that row to the next row, all the way until all of your rows are attached and you have a big square. Then you're gonna come around. Once these are all attached, you'll do the same thing on the sides. You'll fold it in, fold it again, and sew along each edge of the quilt. And that's it. I thought the next time I'd be checking in with you, the quilt would be done. However, I've had a drastic change in direction here. So I've been working on the quilt and I'm really unhappy with the process. It's not coming out well at all. I did tighten my walking foot on my machine by screwing it in a little bit tighter, and that helped a little bit, but not enough to make a real difference. And I'm gonna show you some of the problems that I'm facing and then tell you my new course of action. So I have two big pieces done here. I have these 3 bottom rows and then these 3 top rows. I just laid that on top here. So I really would only have one more seam to sew together before I had to do the edges. However, let me show you some of the problems. And I will say that for some of this, I seam ripped entire pieces out and re-sewed it, and it still is kind of puckering and pulling, but that's kind of the least of the problems. If that was just that, I wouldn't mind so much. But you know, take a look at this, for example. This is just bad. And yes, I could seam rip this out and I could make it better, but this is happening consistently enough throughout the quilt that I would really have to redo huge portions. And in redoing the portions that I've tried, it's only mildly better. These seams are fine because these are the side ones that connected the pieces within the rows seem to have less bulk that it had to go over, but these did not fare so well. And again, if that was the only problem, I would say, you know, fine. However, let me turn the quilt over and show you the other problem. So pieces like here, because I was sewing this from the front, big bunchiness here. Again, over here, big bunchiness, okay? It's not laying flat. So I don't mind in projects when things take longer than I think, or when a different course of action has to be had. That's part of the excitement, that's part of the creativity, it's figuring out obstacles, and I don't mind any of that. But what I was getting, this is one of the most frustrating projects I've done in a long, long time. I was getting very frustrated with this. And the reason for that is because I wasn't seeing a way to change direction to make it better. You know, I tried, like I mentioned, I tried seam ripping some of them, re-sewing them, and it just wasn't getting better. The other thing that I don't care about this quilt as you go that I didn't realize is this. Each one of these seams here, the only thing between the outside of the world and the other outside of the world is some threads. So if you think about a regular quilt, you have the quilt front, you have the batting, and then you have the back. And so if pieces start to rip a little bit, which they do over the course of time, and that's why people mend quilts and things like that, it's not such a big deal because behind it is just a layer of batting. If this seam starts to rip, there's a big hole in your quilt. And there's a ton of seams where that's possible, right? There's seams every 10 inches. There's a seam where if a little rip happens, it's a big hole in your quilt. So I don't care for that. Bottom line, what I'm gonna do is I'm going to take this quilt apart because actually I really like how this is coming out. I think outside of the sloppiness of it, for lack of a better phrase, I think it's looking pretty good. I really like the colors. I really like how the rectangles and squares kind of make up the bigger squares. I really like it. So I'm gonna take this apart, which is actually gonna be more cumbersome even than it sounds because I did do that stitch in the ditch, which means I'm going to not only need to seam, well, I'll probably just cut with a rotary cutter. I'll cut these borders off and then I will have to seam rip all of those stitch in the ditch, which seems crazy, I know. I mean, who would do this? Why am I doing, I keep telling myself it's a quilt for the yard, it's fine. But when it's just bad enough, why am I making something that's the quality is so poor, right? I can't do it. I can't hang this in my yard. So I'm gonna do that. I'm not gonna take you through the whole process of taking these apart, but what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna take everything apart. I'm gonna re-sew everything together. I'm gonna sew a full quilt top and then do a normal quilting technique. Sew the quilt top, put the batting in the middle, make a full backing. I might even just cut out a large piece of fabric, I don't know yet, and bind it up. And then it'll be ready for the yard, and hopefully it'll be something I'm really proud of and that won't provide me stress every time I look at it, because that's what I foresee happening. I foresee myself out in my yard enjoying the great outdoors and looking at the quilt and being like, oh my God, what a nightmare. I don't want to feel that way. So I'm gonna do this the right way and I'll report back to you, hopefully with some good news. Bye. Okay, everybody, I have been hard at work here, but I have my quilt top done. As you can see, here it is on the dining room table, and I just finished basting the top onto the batting with my adhesive spray. And this is the adhesive spray that I use. And so right now you can see the edge of my batting here, and my quilt top is now kind of lightly glued to the batting using the spray. I'm trimming off the batting here, and then I will put my quilt backing on, quilt backing done, right here. And then I'll put the binding on and the quilt will be finished. Hello, it's a couple days later and I have finished the quilt. Here it is. And I'm really happy with it. I love this quilt now so much. And I will take pictures. I'll lay this flat and take pictures so that you can see it better. But here it is for now. And I know I said that I was gonna kind of cut along the lines to save myself some time and then pick out the seams and the stitch in the ditch, but I actually ended up not doing any cutting and I seam ripped apart the entire thing, which seems a little nutty, and I felt a little nutty doing it, but I'm so happy I did. I really made the correct choice. I was not enjoying the process as I was realizing that the quilt was not coming out technically very good. And I am by no means a perfectionist. I completely accept imperfections in all my work and other people's work. I think it's part of the process and it's fine. But this quilt was not going well, and I liked it too much to let it be kind of a crappy quilt. So as the second that I decided that I was taking it apart and redoing it, I was so much happier. I started really enjoying the process, and I made the right choice. So it was funny because while I was taking apart this quilt and putting it back together, I was watching some videos and I happened to follow Tula Pink on Facebook. Tula Pink is a famous fabric designer and I really like her stuff. And so I follow her on Facebook, and every Tuesday she has a video kind of showing what she's doing. And she happened to be English paper piecing some hexagons together for this big quilt that she's making. And she had sewn all the hexagons backwards so that the dark was on the left and it was supposed to be on the right or something like like that. And so she was taking apart this whole thing. And I thought to myself, why is she doing that? Why is she just not letting it be on the right instead on the left? Who cares? And then I immediately realized that I was pretty much doing the same exact thing. And I was like, oh, I get it. Yes. We makers, we're crazy people. We take things apart that probably were just fine, but that's okay. Because I really love this now, and that's the important thing. So one of my favorite parts about this quilt is the binding. And the binding ended up being a stripe, which was kind of unexpected to me. The fabric that I used for the binding is this one here. And it is a stripey kind of fabric, but I didn't realize how stripey it was gonna look in the binding. And what I love about it is, depending on what part of the binding you're at, the stripe is a different color. Because I wasn't particular when I was cutting my binding strips, some of the binding strips have kind of a yellow, some of them have a white or a pink or a red. So here you have like the red and pink, but then as you travel over, it's a white and pink. And as you go around, now you can see kind of some of the yellow, the color of the binding changes. And I think that is super, super cool. So I think that that looks great. So I'm gonna take a bunch of pictures of the quilt all laid out so that you can see it in its full glory, front and the back. And then the weather's supposed to be kind of crummy over the next couple days. So I'm gonna hang the quilt in the yard next week. So that'll be episode 3 of this series. But I will post a different craft video prior to that. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. And thanks so much for joining me. This has been fun, kind of crazy, a little stressful at times, but I would say total success. So thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time. Bye.